We're ready to get our binding on our quilt. Now when I walk over to my machine with my binding, it's all in loops, and I drop it to the right of my machine and hang the end over the machine that has that 45-degree line on it. I want to start with that end. So just leave it hanging up there. Now your stitch length can be looser. We don't want it a basting stitch, but it can be looser than it was before. We're going to have to do a couple of trial runs to make sure we get our stitch width or our width from our edge to make sure it's right. We want a nice full binding. We don't want one that wrinkles and is loose and won't make a nice point at the corners. We're going to take our quilt top and we want to start just beyond one of the corners. About 2 feet into the quilt, we're going to put that part up there. We're going to take our binding. We want to match the edge of the binding with the edge of the quilt. Now we don't want to start at the very end. We want to start about 6 to 8 inches from the end, and you may even want to go at least 8 inches to begin with. It's a little cumbersome at the end getting it together until you know what you're doing. Now I know where mine has to be to have the correct width from the edge of the material. However, you will have to try this out on your machine. And the way we're going to test it, we're going to make our seam width a little more than 1/4 inch, and we're going to use a long stitch, and that way if we need to adjust something, it's not hard to take out. If you didn't go wide enough, you don't have to take out the previous stitching, but if you went too wide, you have to take that out. So we want to take little bites until we find out where it should be. We want to get ready and take a couple of stitches in, and then leave your needle down and line your binding up with the edge of your quilt. You do not want to pull on anything, but you want to make sure they're even and that there's no looseness there. We're going to start stitching along the edge. Keep the edge of your binding and your quilt even. We do not want our width of our seam to do this. We want to stay even with the right of the presser foot. And we'll sew about 6 inches, and then we're going to test it. Okay, I've done enough. I'm going to test them. I'll take it off. Use this little cutter on your machine. It's really nice. Now, what we want our seam to do, when we get this on here, we're going to flip it to the back, and we want it barely to go past our seam line that we just put in there. We want a nice full binding. We do not want one that's loose. And I'll give you a closer shot in just a moment. But we've tested it. If it's still going way beyond that seam line, you need to make your seam width wider. Either move your quilt under your needle or move the needle, whatever your machine allows you to do. But we need to take enough to where it just barely comes past the seam line we just made on the back. So we'll get this binding on here. This is the seam that I just sewed along the edge of my binding. I came in enough that I thought when I flip my binding over, we're going to flip it to the back. So if I turn my quilt over, see the stitching line I just made is right here. I want my quilt binding to barely overlap that stitch line. If it does that, your stitch width, your seam width is correct. If it goes too far, you need to make a wider seam width. If it doesn't quite come to it, you need to do narrower. So play with that a little bit and get that correct, and then we will finish putting our binding on. I have sewn to the corner of my quilt so that I have stopped the same distance from the end as I am from the edge of the quilt. In other words, my seam width to the side is the distance I stop from the end of the quilt, the edge of the quilt. To check this, I'm going to turn it sideways, put my presser foot down, and I will pull this back, and if I can see any quilt showing here, I've gone too far. I'm going to reverse off of the quilt at this point. I'll pull the quilt over here. Now, I describe this as I'm going to take my binding and I'm going to go north. I'm going to go up above the quilt with it. I want to finger crease. It should come out, that point should come out right at the edge of the quilt, the corner of the quilt. So you go up and then you come down. When you come down, hold that bottom piece in place until you can get your finger on the top, and then slide it down to where the top fold is even with this edge of the quilt and the right side is even with this edge of the quilt. Now this gets really easy. After a couple of quilts, you've got it down. Now put your presser foot down to where the right edge of the presser foot is at the edge of the quilt again. Whatever width you had to do the other way, coming down, you want that same seam width. So we're going to start coming in this direction. We will go all the way to the other corner. We will do this on all four corners, and then I'll show you how to connect your binding. I'm on the last side of the quilt now. This is the beginning edge where we left that tail. I want to stop maybe 15 to 18 inches from there. So we'll have some working room, and I want to be able to really show you how to do this easily. So when you have about 15 to 18 inches, these two should just overlap really good. We're going to stop. You don't have to back stitch or anything. Just take it out from under there and cut your thread, and then I'll show you the next step.